The courtroom fell into a deadly silence, the kind that comes right before everything explodes. Victor Hale didn't walk into the New York Superior Court, he paraded in. A billionaire's smile on his face, a $20,000 suit on his back, and his pregnant mistress, Lena, on his arm. He believed the war was over. His money, his lawyers, his power, he was certain he had already won. From across the room, he glanced at his wife, Mara, seated quietly, looking small, defeated. What Victor didn't notice was the man behind the bench. Judge Caldwell. And more importantly, the sealed envelope in his hand. Because inside that envelope was a truth that would turn Victor Hale's billions into dust. Now, before this unfolds, hit subscribe if you love courtroom revenge stories like this, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, because this one is about to get brutal. Courtroom 7B had seen its share of public collapses, criminal confessions, shattered empires, desperate pleas. But nothing quite like the performance Victor Hale delivered that morning. The heavy wooden doors swung open with theatrical weight. Victor entered as if stepping onto a red carpet instead of into a final divorce hearing. 6'2". Perfect posture. Hair slicked back with deliberate precision. Every detail calibrated for dominance. The tailored charcoal suit hugged his frame like power stitched into fabric. The watch on his wrist alone cost more than most people's annual salary. And then there was Lena. Young. Radiant. Dangerous. Her crimson dress curved tightly around her swollen belly, an obvious and intentional display. Not subtle. Not accidental. It was a public declaration. Fertility, replacement, victory. Victor's hand rested on the small of her back as if to say, "This is mine now." The gallery didn't whisper. It inhaled. Gasps rippled through the rows, journalists, junior associates, interns, curious onlookers who had come to witness the final assets ruling of one of the most powerful men in American logistics. Bringing a mistress to court was already a violation of taste. Bringing a visibly pregnant one was annihilation by spectacle. Victor guided Lena to the front row behind his defense table. She moved with slow, deliberate confidence, chin high, eyes alert, absorbing every stare like fuel. When they reached their seats, Victor leaned down and murmured something into her ear. She laughed quietly, sharp, high, cutting clean through the silence. He kissed her cheek. Then he turned. Across the aisle sat Mara. Victor didn't see the woman who had once outworked him, outbuilt him, outthought him. He saw only what he wanted to see, defeat. Mara Hale sat alone at the plaintiff's table, hands folded neatly in her lap. No designer labels. No theatrical makeup. Just a slate-gray blazer, simple blouse, dark slacks. Her posture was straight but restrained. Her face calm, unreadable. To the untrained eye, she looked exactly like the woman Victor believed she had become. Discarded, outdated, irrelevant. He smirked. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Hale, take your seat." Victor gave a lazy nod and slid into the leather chair beside his attorney, Damian Cross, New York's most expensive divorce strategist, infamous for turning multimillion-dollar settlements into legal executions. "Ready to finish this?" Victor murmured, just loud enough for Mara to hear. "I have lunch at Le Signer at 1. I'd rather not be late." Damien flipped open a folder thick with contracts, valuations, forensic reports. Mara's side of the table held exactly one thin file. "She has no leverage," Damien said without looking up. "The prenup is airtight. With the child involved, the court will prioritize liquidity for your new family. This will be quick." Victor adjusted his cufflinks. "Good." Across the aisle, Mara's attorney, Evelyn Parker, leaned closer. "Don't look at them," she said quietly. "Let him think he's already won." Mara's eyes stayed forward. "He brought her." "I know. She's showing." "I know." Evelyn's gaze hardened as she glanced at Lena in the gallery, now scrolling lazily through her phone. And that's exactly why today ends differently than he expects. The courtroom rose as Judge Robert Caldwell entered. 63 years old. Broad-shouldered. Steel-gray hair combed back with military discipline. His reputation preceded him. Brilliant, brutal, immune to intimidation. Corporate empires feared him. Politicians avoided him. Billionaires underestimated him once. He settled behind the bench without ceremony. His eyes lifted and landed directly on Victor Hale. Then, with a subtle shift, they moved to Lena. A flicker of disapproval crossed his face before vanishing behind judicial stone. "Be seated." The room obeyed. Judge Caldwell opened the case file. "We are here for the final determination in the matter of Hale versus Hale, division of marital assets, alimony considerations, and dissolution of marriage. He looked up. Have both parties submitted final financial disclosures? Yes, Your Honor, Damien said smoothly as he stood. My client has been entirely transparent. Mr. Hale has extended a generous settlement offer given the circumstances, despite Mrs. Hale's minimal contribution to the company across the last decade. Mara's fingers tightened once in her lap. Plaintiff? Caldwell asked. Evelyn stood. We've submitted all required documents, including additional exhibits regarding the defendant's financial structuring and recent asset transfers. Victor chuckled softly and leaned back in his chair, unbothered. In his mind, the offshore accounts were sealed, the shell companies led beyond reach. The intellectual property sat safely in trusts he believed were untouchable. He had moved faster than they could track. Or so he thought. Judge Caldwell studied him for a moment, then said evenly, Mr. Hale, I see you've brought a guest. Victor stood, buttoned his jacket, and smiled with polished charm. Yes, Your Honor. This is Lena Ward, my fiancée and the mother of my future son. The room stirred. Fiancé, Caldwell repeated slowly. While you are still legally married. Technicality, Victor said with a dismissive flick of his wrist. This marriage ended long ago. I felt it was only right for Lena to be present. The ruling directly affects our child's welfare. The welfare of the child, the judge echoed, tapping his pen once against the bench. Tap, tap, tap. His eyes lowered briefly to the sealed envelope resting beside his file. No one else seemed to notice it. Thick paper. Official stamp. The quiet weight of something irreversible. Very well, he said. Let us proceed. Victor sank back into his seat, pleased. Across the aisle, Mara didn't move. Didn't blink. For the first time that morning, the faintest trace of a smile touched her lips. The faint smile on Mara's lips vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. To everyone else, it meant nothing. To Victor, who wasn't even looking at her anymore, it meant even less. But buried beneath that moment, so brief it could be mistaken for muscle tension, was 10 years of calculation. 10 years of architecture. Long before the skyscrapers, the logistics hubs, the trade contracts stitched across 3 continents. There had been nothing but a folding table in a rented office on the south side of Brooklyn, a dying laptop, and 2 people who believed ambition counted as currency. Victor had been loud back then. Charismatic. Impossible to ignore. The kind of man who talked in projections and promises, always 5 years ahead of reality. Mara had been quiet. Not shy, precise. While Victor chased investors and sold futures he hadn't yet built, Mara wrote the systems that made the promises real. She drew the software frameworks, built the routing algorithms, designed the automation that cut shipping times in half and overhead by a third. Every early contract that made Hale Freight viable ran through code she had written after midnight, fueled by instant coffee and ruthless focus. But Victor had stood at the podium when the checks arrived, and Mara had stood behind him, believing partnership meant patience. They married fast. Too fast. Success accelerated everything: money, attention, temptation, erosion. As Hale Freight scaled from regional distributor to global logistics dominator, the company became Victor's witness and Mara's possession. Not legally. Functionally. Yet by the time the press named Victor the youngest self-made billionaire in logistics, the narrative had already hardened into myth. Victor Hale, the visionary. Mara Hale, the supportive wife. And myths, once accepted, are nearly impossible to overwrite. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in through boardrooms where Mara's access was quietly reduced. Through hiring decisions made without her. Through patents filed under Victor's name alone. Patents for systems that had originated in her notebooks. At first, she protested. Then she documented. By the time she realized Victor was no longer drifting from her but actively exiting her orbit, she had already begun building something invisible. Not a counterattack. A ledger. The affair surfaced 2 years later through a delayed hotel invoice mistakenly routed to her email. One name. One night. One corporate card. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so surgical. Victor denied it. Then minimized it. Then reframed it as stress. 6 months after that, Lena appeared, first as an assistant, then as a shadow, then as a rumor too loud to ignore. By the time the pregnancy surfaced, Victor had already restructured the company. By the time the divorce papers arrived, he believed he had insulated everything. By the time he walked into courtroom 7B, he believed Mara had nothing left. What Victor never considered, never truly accounted for, was that Mara had stopped fighting him where he could see her. She had redirected. Every ledger entry he altered, she preserved. Every trust he assembled, she traced. Every shell company he buried behind legal fog, she illuminated through code and timestamped access logs. He had mistaken her silence for surrender. In reality, it was migration. She had moved the battlefield. At the plaintiff's table, Mara shifted her hands slightly, adjusting the simple wedding band still resting on her finger. Across the aisle, Lena's own ring flashed under the courtroom lights, large, assertive, brand new. Victor leaned toward Damien. How long before we're done? Damien didn't hesitate. Once the asset summary is read into the record, maybe 90 minutes. You'll walk with liquidity intact. She'll take the maintenance. Clean separation. Victor smiled faintly. Good. I'm tired of pretending she still exists. On the other side of the aisle, Evelyn Parker opened her briefcase. Inside were no thick binders, no dramatic stacks of paperwork. Just a tablet, a compact data drive, and one sealed envelope sent by court order to arrive precisely at 8:42 a.m. Which it had. Judge Caldwell's pen tapped once against the bench. Counselors, he said evenly. Before we enter the financial disclosures into record, there is an administrative matter to address. Victor didn't look up. He was still smiling. Victor was still smiling. The kind of smile that came from certainty, the unshakable belief that the board was already cleared and the final move belonged to him. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle crossing over the opposite knee, posture loose, casual, victorious. Judge Caldwell's gaze rested on him for a moment longer than necessary. Before we proceed with the standard asset disclosures, the judge said, voice calm but weighted, the court has received supplementary documentation relevant to ownership determination. That was the moment Victor finally looked up. Ownership, Damien repeated, his fingers pausing over the file in front of him. Your Honor, ownership was resolved during preliminary hearings. The corporate entities fall squarely under Mr. Hale's control. So you asserted, Caldwell replied evenly. He reached to his left and lifted the sealed envelope. It was thick enough to be meaningful, official enough to be dangerous. The courtroom didn't breathe as he broke the seal with careful precision, sliding the contents out in a slow, deliberate motion. Mara didn't move. Evelyn didn't blink. Victor's smile tightened, just slightly. These documents, Caldwell said, were delivered to the court under mandatory disclosure statute. They include a certified copy of a will, a chain of title verification, and a posthumous equity transfer authorization. Victor let out a quiet laugh. A will? You're introducing probate into a divorce proceeding. Judge Caldwell's eyes lifted. Yes. The word landed heavier than it should have. Because the estate in question, he continued, directly affects the legitimacy of corporate ownership claimed by the defendant. Damien stood again, sharper this time. Your Honor, with all respect, none of this is relevant unless the estate has controlling interest, which it does not. Caldwell turned a page. Then another. Then he stopped. The estate, he said, held 49% initial stake at incorporation, with conditional majority control triggered upon breach of marital fidelity, contractual fraud, or unlawful asset redirection. Victor's foot slipped from his knee. What? He said. The gallery rippled. Lena leaned forward, confusion cracking through her composure. Victor, what is he talking about? Judge Caldwell lifted his eyes. The estate belonged to one Samuel Rothman. The name moved through the room like current through water. Evelyn rose smoothly. Samuel Rothman was Mrs. Hale's father. Victor stood abruptly. That man died broke. Everyone knew that. Mara lifted her eyes for the first time that morning. Judge Caldwell's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Mr. Rothman was declared bankrupt in public filings, yes. However, this court now recognizes documentation verifying that his bankruptcy protected a series of silent trusts registered in international holding structures. Those trusts directly funded Hale Freight's earliest operational expansion. Victor turned toward Mara, disbelief slicing through his face. You knew about this. She held his gaze. She didn't answer. Furthermore, Caldwell continued, Mr. Rothman's will establishes that those funds were not gifts. He paused. They were conditional investments. The word investment hit harder than any accusation. Control was transferred into the Hale corporate entity through a layered ownership program. However, ultimate authority remained dormant until violation. Damien's face had gone colorless. Violation of what terms? Judge Caldwell raised the document. Infidelity. Fraudulent misrepresentation. Asset shielding designed to deprive the secondary stakeholder. Victor's voice cracked, sharp and disbelieving. This is insane. She signed the prenup. She waived equity claims. Incorrect, Caldwell said. She waived direct marital claims, not inherited controlling clauses governed by third-party estate law. Silence crashed down. Lena's hand slid unconsciously over her stomach. Victor, are we okay? Victor didn't answer. He was staring at Mara now as if she was someone he had never met, someone built from angles and shadows instead of memory. You planned this, he said. Mara's voice was steady. You planned around me. I planned beyond you. Judge Caldwell continued, relentless. Upon breach, the estate's dormant shares activated and transferred controlling authority to the secondary beneficiary, Mrs. Mara Hale, effective immediately upon court validation. Damien slammed his folder shut. That's impossible. Then you may appeal, Caldwell said calmly. But until such time, this court now recognizes Mrs. Hale as majority-controlling stakeholder of Hale Freight Solutions. The courtroom didn't erupt. It collapsed inward. Victor staggered back a half step, gripping the edge of the firm table, pupils contracted, breath shallow. You're saying she owns? 51%, Caldwell finished. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Victor Hale looked small. On the gallery bench, Lena rose halfway from her seat, panic stripping the color from her face. Victor, fix this. You told me everything was untouchable. Victor didn't look at her. He couldn't. His entire empire had just shifted one legal inch, an inch wide enough to swallow him whole. The courtroom had not erupted, but the energy inside it had shifted violently, like pressure recoiling from a sudden fracture. Victor stood frozen, one hand braced against the table as if the floor itself had tilted. The word majority echoed in his head, looping, distorting. 51% wasn't just control, it was authority over every decision, every account, every future. Lena reached for his arm. Victor, say something. He pulled away without looking at her. Damien recovered first, though too quickly for it to be confidence. Your Honor, even if the court recognizes a controlling interest shift, this does not negate the validity of Mr. Hale's existing financial structures. Offshore entities, intellectual property trusts, and international holdings remain under his authority. Judge Caldwell met his eyes. Do they? Victor's pulse spiked. Caldwell turned another page inside the file. The court also received an independent forensic audit initiated 18 months ago through a blind submission channel. Mara's name was nowhere near that sentence. But this was her fingerprint. The judge continued. That audit details a pattern of asset redirection designed to shield corporate revenue from marital division and taxation. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Routing through Singapore-based holding entities. Phantom vendor contracts. Damien swallowed. Are you alleging fraud? I am stating verified findings, Caldwell said. And since Hale Freight is now under majority control of Mrs. Hale, the question before this court is no longer divorce alone. Victor's lawyer slowly Saturday. Lena turned fully toward Victor now, fear tearing through her voice. You said everything was legal. Victor exhaled sharply. It was legal, until she touched it. Mara didn't flinch. Evelyn rose. Your Honor, my client is prepared to formally authorize full internal cooperation with federal forensic auditors, effective immediately. The word federal moved through the courtroom like a tremor. Victor snapped his head toward Mara. You wouldn't. Her voice didn't rise. You already did. Judge Caldwell nodded. Then I will note for the record, the court recognizes the activation of regulatory oversight under Mrs. Hale's authority. Effective today, Hale Freight Solutions will enter compliance review under federal commercial fraud and international trade statutes. Lena's breath broke. Victor, that means prison, doesn't it? He finally looked at her. And in that look, she saw it, the first real fracture in the man she had believed was untouchable. Not fear yet. But calculation under pressure. Damage control failing to keep pace. Damien leaned toward him urgently. If they freeze the accounts. They won't, Victor hissed. They can't. The vaults are insulated. Judge Caldwell lifted his gaze again. The court has already approved provisional freeze orders on 6 major international accounts tied to the Hale Freight network. Notices were served this morning. Victor's chair scraped sharply as he stood. On what authority? On hers, Caldwell replied evenly, nodding once toward Mara. Victor turned fully toward her now, disbelief giving way to fury. You think this makes you powerful? Mara stood. The movement was small, but it shifted the entire room toward her. No, she said calmly. This makes me finished hiding. Victor laughed once, sharp and cracked. You think you can run that company without me? Evelyn answered for her. She already has. Damien looked sharply at her. Excuse me. For the last 14 months, Evelyn continued, Mrs. Hale has served as the company's anonymous systems architect, restructuring internal operations under secured identity. Routing, inventory prediction, customs automation. Your client has been profiting from her work without knowing it. Victor stared at Mara. Every gain you celebrated, she said evenly, was built on systems you locked me out of. I just stopped asking permission to improve them. Silence held again, but this time it wasn't suspense. It was recognition. Judge Caldwell adjusted the file stack before him. This court will recess for 15 minutes before proceeding with the revised asset determination and the referral docket. He struck the gavel once. The sound landed like a gunshot. Victor didn't move as the room erupted into motion around him. Reporters scrambling, attorneys whispering urgently, spectators buzzing with sudden permission to react. Lena stood at his side, visibly shaking. Victor, she whispered, we need to leave. He didn't answer. Across the room, Mara calmly gathered her tablet from the table. Evelyn leaned toward her. Once we come back, there's no reversing this. Mara nodded. It was never meant to be reversed. As she turned toward the exit, Victor finally spoke again, his voice low, bitter, and suddenly unsure. You think this is winning? Mara paused at the aisle. She didn't turn back. This is accounting, she said. Winning is next. This is accounting, she had said. Winning is next. The words stayed with Victor as the courtroom emptied around him. Not echoed. Pressed. The 15-minute recess dissolved whatever illusion of control he had left. Phones lit up across the gallery. Assistants whispered into headsets. Two men in dark suits appeared quietly at the back doors, unintroduced, unannounced, unmistakably federal. By the time Victor noticed them, it was already too late to pretend they were coincidence. Lena followed his stare. Who are they? She whispered. Victor didn't answer. Damien returned from a hurried phone call, jaw tight. We have a problem. Victor laughed under his breath. We had a problem 20 minutes ago. This is different, Damien said. Customs and Border Protection just flagged multiple Hale freight containers in Port Newark. They are being held for inspection under joint federal authorization. Victor's expression sharpened. That doesn't happen without cause. It does when someone pushes a button you didn't know existed. Across the aisle, Mara stood with Evelyn near the exit, speaking quietly. No urgency. No chaos. Just control unfolding on schedule. One of the federal agents approached Judge Caldwell's bench as the gavel sounded again. All rise. The courtroom returned to silence, but now it was a different kind. Not suspense. Threat. Judge Caldwell resumed his seat. We will continue. Victor remained standing. The agent stepped forward. Your Honor, pursuant to court-recognized authority granted to majority stakeholder Mara Hale, multiple federal agencies are initiating parallel investigations into Hale Freight Solutions' international operations. Caldwell nodded. Proceed. The agent turned toward Victor. Mr. Hale, you are not under arrest at this moment, but you are now subject to formal investigation under federal fraud, tax evasion, and international trade compliance statutes. Your passport is to be surrendered immediately. Lena gasped audibly. Victor's voice was calm, too calm. You can't seize my mobility without charges. Temporary travel restriction under probable cause, the agent replied. Your attorney will receive full documentation. Victor turned to Damien. Damien didn't meet his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, Victor reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed his passport. The small blue booklet felt absurdly light in his hand. He held it a moment longer than necessary, then placed it in the agent's outstretched palm. The sound it made was almost nothing, but it was the loudest sound of the day. Lena staggered back into her seat. Victor, what's happening? He finally looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no answer ready. Across the room, Evelyn rose once more. Your Honor, based on the court's recognition of Mrs. Hale's controlling authority, we formally request immediate access to all corporate financial systems, including escrow accounts previously concealed under foreign holdings. Damien stood again, voice strained. This violates. It enforces, Caldwell cut in. Granted. The judge turned toward Mara. Mrs. Hale, your authority is now active across all domestic and international operational accounts. I suggest you use it carefully. Mara inclined her head. I already have. Within seconds, phones began vibrating across Victor's legal team. One by one, his lawyers froze as notifications flooded in: account locks, transaction failures, fund reversals, compliance flags. Damien's screen went white. "Victor," he said quietly, "they are freezing your personal liquidity." Victor's breath shortened. Across the room, Lena's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. She lifted it, frowning, and then the color drained from her face. "What is it?" he asked. "My apartment account," she whispered. "My card just declined." Victor felt something crack, sharp and low in his chest. He turned toward Mara again. "What did you do?" She finally met his eyes fully. "Everything you taught me to," she said. "Just without stealing." The judge watched the exchange without interference. For several long seconds, Victor said nothing. Then he laughed. Not loudly. Not convincingly. "You think this ends me," he said. "You think shifting numbers on screens gives you victory." Mara's voice remained level. "No. It gives me truth." The agent approached again. "Mr. Hale, we will require your cooperation regarding several flagged trade corridors involving falsified invoices and sanctioned territories." Victor's smile vanished completely now. Lena stood abruptly. "I didn't sign up for this. You told me this was a clean empire." Victor didn't respond. She took a step away from him. Then another. For the first time, the distance between them wasn't symbolic. It was physical. Judge Caldwell leaned forward. "This court will now proceed with revised spousal determinations in light of the newly established majority ownership and active investigations." Victor remained standing. Alone. Surrounded. For the first time in his life, the room was no longer listening to him. It was measuring him. For the first time in his life, the room was no longer listening to Victor. It was measuring him. Judge Caldwell adjusted the files once more, his voice steady, unhurried. "We will now proceed with spousal determinations under revised authority." Victor remained standing, slow-moving now, as if motion itself had grown heavier. Damien leaned toward him urgently, whispering damage control strategies that were already aging into irrelevance. Lena stood several feet away from him. She hadn't moved far, but far enough to break the illusion. "I didn't know any of this," she said quietly, as if appealing to the room itself. "He told me everything was clean." No one answered her. The agent stepped forward again. "Mr. Hale, we now have confirmation that 11 international trade routes tied to your logistics network were utilized for misrepresented cargo valuation. Several intersect with restricted markets." Victor exhaled slowly through his nose. "You're stacking assumptions." The agent's gaze didn't waver. "We're stacking evidence." Across the aisle, Mara watched without expression. This wasn't rage. This wasn't triumph. This was execution by exposure. "Mrs. Hale," Judge Caldwell said, turning toward her, "do you wish to make a statement before the court proceeds with formal resolution?" Mara stood. The movement was deliberate. Grounded. The weight of 10 years settled into the room with her. "Yes," she said. Victor finally looked fully at her, no longer furious, no longer certain, just searching. "You took everything from me," he said hoarsely. Mara met his stare. "You took it from yourself and assumed I'd never count it." She turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, this marriage did not collapse because of money. It collapsed because control became more valuable to him than partnership. The will didn't destroy him. His belief that no one could see past him did." The room remained silent. Even the reporters had stilled. Caldwell inclined his head. Statement entered. He turned toward Victor. "Mr. Hale, effective immediately, marital dissolution is granted in favor of Mrs. Hale. All spousal support claims are denied based on financial misconduct. Furthermore," he paused, "your voting privileges within Hale Freight Solutions are hereby suspended pending federal investigation outcome." Suspended. Not removed. Suspended. The word that meant limbo. Limbo meant slow death. Victor gripped the table again. Damien whispered urgently, "This is no longer civil exposure. This is criminal risk. Whatever leverage you think you have left, use it now." Victor's gaze slid toward Lena. She was already shaking her head. "I can't do this," she whispered. "They'll look into everything connected to you. My name is everywhere now." "You're carrying my child," he said sharply. "You don't get to walk away." She looked at him then. Really looked this time. "For the first time," she said, "I see the bars." The agent approached again. "Mr. Hale, based on cumulative evidence now under joint investigation, you are being placed under conditional detainment pending formal charges." The words landed without drama. No cuffs yet. No spectacle. But everyone understood what conditional meant. Victor straightened slowly. For years, every room he entered bent toward him. Now the room leaned away. He glanced once more at Mara. You think this makes you untouchable? She met his eyes for the last time. No. It makes me done. Caldwell's gavel struck. Once. Final. 2 agents stepped in on either side of Victor, not restraining him, not guiding him, just removing the illusion that he was free. Lena backed away fully now, retreating into the gallery as though distance could erase association. Her hand hovered over her stomach as fear finally replaced ambition. As Victor was escorted toward the side exit, reporters surged, restrained by bailiffs as cameras rose and shutters exploded into controlled chaos. Mr. Hale, did you siphon funds through shell routes? Is your company cooperating with federal authorities? Was your marriage a strategic front? Victor didn't answer a single question. He didn't look back. Across the room, Mara remained standing at the plaintiff's table, quiet amid the storm, watching the consequences she had spent years designing finally move without her. Evelyn stepped beside her. Once the charges hit public record, there's no coming back from this. Mara nodded. That was the point. Outside the courtroom, sirens wailed faintly, distant for now, but closing fast. And for the first time since this had begun, Victor Hale understood something he had never considered possible. The game was no longer about survival. It was about what remained after the collapse. The game was no longer about survival. It was about what remained after the collapse. By nightfall, the fallout had outpaced the sirens. Victor Hale's name burned through financial media like a controlled detonation. Trading floors paused. Shipping indices stuttered. By the time the markets closed, Hale Freight Solutions had been suspended pending federal compliance review, an unprecedented move that sent shockwaves through international logistics. Screens across the world replayed the same courtroom still, Victor being escorted through a side exit, flanked by agents, jaw clenched, eyes empty. The billionaire myth was officially dead. At dawn the next morning, subpoenas followed. Board members resigned in waves, some in panic, some in preemptive distancing. International partners issued public temporary disengagements, the corporate equivalent of denial dressed as diplomacy. And at the center of it all sat Mara Hale, majority stakeholder, interim chair, visible at last. The Hale Freight Executive Tower had always been Victor's fortress, steel, glass, and reputation. Now, security cleared corridors for her without hesitation. Her key card activated floors that had once required 3 layers of approval. The same offices that had once reduced her to invited guest now registered her as final authority. The transition wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. She closed 5 shell subsidiaries before noon. She authorized federal compliance access without delay. She reopened the internal audit protocols Victor had buried years earlier. By midday, the company was bleeding truth. Evelyn stood beside her in the corner office that had once belonged to Victor. Public perception is split, she said. Some see you as the villain who detonated her own empire. Others see you as the architect who reclaimed it. Mara studied the skyline beyond the windows. Perception was never the objective. Down in the city, Lena watched the same screens from a silent apartment whose lock she now paid for alone. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, lawyers, reporters, estranged friends returning credit calls. None of them asked how she was. They all asked how much she knew. She knew now how little she had ever been shown. By noon, her engagement ring sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Gold didn't feel powerful anymore. It felt traceable. And Victor sat in a private federal holding suite the press wasn't allowed to name. No cuffs. No jumpsuit. Just 4 walls, 3 agents, and a table full of questions that no longer had margins. Every route, every offshore channel, every falsified invoice. They already knew the shape of his crimes. Now they wanted the map. Your ex-wife has signed a cooperation order, one of the agents told him quietly. Every system is open to us now. Victor stared at the blank tabletop. For the first time in decades, his mind reached for a lever that no longer existed. 3 days later, the first indictments hit public record. 5 counts of federal fraud, 2 counts of trade violation, 1 charge tied to international sanctions breach. Potential sentence, life measured in decades, not years. The world reacted exactly as it always does, loudly, briefly, and with appetite. But inside the silence of boardrooms and locked interrogation rooms, something else settled in. Finality. The last time Victor and Mara shared the same space was not in a courtroom. It was in a conference room 3 weeks later. He was brought in under supervision. No media, no drama, no romance left in the ruins. He looked smaller now. Not physically. Structurally. The architecture of him had failed. Mara entered alone. No attorney. No witnesses. Just accounting. He waited for fury. For vindication. She offered neither. They are offering me a deal, he said quietly. Reduced sentence. Full cooperation. Corporate forfeiture. She nodded. It won't save you. I didn't expect it to. Silence filled the room, dense, unadorned. You always planned this, he said. Not accusation anymore. Recognition. I always corrected you, she replied. You just never noticed. He exhaled slowly. You could have destroyed me faster. That wouldn't have been justice, she said. That would have been emotion. For a moment, something like regret surfaced in his eyes. It didn't matter. When the agents returned to escort him out, Victor stopped at the door. What happens to the company? Mara met his gaze once more. It finally becomes real. It finally becomes real. Victor was escorted out without another word. That was the last time Mara ever saw him. The trials did not come quickly. Justice, when scaled to the level of power Victor once held, moved with deliberate weight. Motions were filed. Counterclaims attempted. Deals whispered in back channels that no longer opened doors. But the evidence did not bend. Mara's cooperation dismantled an empire with forensic precision. Every falsified route, every shadow account, every trade corridor masked behind shell contracts. What Victor had built in layers of deception was stripped down to framework and fracture. The verdict came 18 months later. Guilty on 7 federal counts. Guilty without spectacle. The sentence was read without drama, numbers stacked like stone. 27 years. No parole consideration for 2 decades. No corporate privileges. No executive protections. Victor Hale entered prison not as a legend fallen, but as a system corrected. Lena watched the verdict from a quiet corner of the world that no longer cared who she had once been tied to. The spotlight had devoured her relevance as fast as it had elevated it. The fortune she had expected never arrived. The child, born months earlier, carried a last name now associated with records, not riches. She never contacted Mara. Some distances cannot be crossed without becoming something else. Hale Freight Solutions reopened under new public leadership 18 weeks after final compliance restoration. But everyone inside the industry knew the truth. It had already reopened the moment Mara touched the systems again. Under her authority, the company did not chase the illusions Victor once sold. It stabilized. It shrunk strategically. It exited questionable corridors and rebuilt credibility contract by contract. Profits returned slower, but they returned clean. Investors said she lacked flash. Markets said she lacked ambition. But logistics professionals said something better. She lacked waste. Years later, a business journal would call her the woman who reprogrammed control. She never accepted the interview. On the anniversary of the verdict, Mara visited the river that cut through the northern edge of the city, quiet, unremarkable, permanent. She stood there without ceremony, hands in the pockets of a coat that held no symbols of victory. Evelyn joined her in silence. You could have disappeared after all this, Evelyn said. No one would have blamed you. Mara nodded. But then he would still exist in everything I ran from. And now? Now he only exists on paper. They stood together as barges passed slowly beneath steel bridges, containers stacked clean, routed with systems that no longer lied about where things were going. Justice didn't roar. It reorganized. Far away, behind concrete walls and schedules that did not bend for names, Victor learned something he had never learned in boardrooms or courtrooms. Power doesn't vanish loudly. It evaporates quietly when no one answers to it anymore. And Mara learned that survival was never the victory. Visibility was. Not as a headline, not as a scandal, but as a woman who no longer had to hide the architecture of her own life.